Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. We're going to be doing it a little bit differently today because, as you've noticed, I am not sitting at my desk, but I'm standing because I want to talk tonight about building better answers and having students create reading responses that you are happily surprised to mark. I find in my own classroom, this is always an issue that I have to work with my students to deal with, is how to construct an answer that is simply goes beyond a simple one-sentence answer, and they can construct a reading response that looks and feels more like a thorough, well-detailed paragraph. So we're going to look at 3 different ways that I use in my classroom to help my students build those better answers. And I'm going to use my bulletin board here behind me so that I can actually show you some of those things that I'm using with my students. So throughout the years, I've used 3 different methods. I use them often interchangeably. Some methods make more sense to my students than others, so I will sort of play it by ear depending on what group I happen to have in front of me. That is the method that I will use, and I think each one of them have pros and cons, so we're going to look at that. The first thing I wanted to talk about tonight is the bump it up wall. So this is an assessment strategy that allows students to understand the differences in their answers between what a level 1 would look like, what a level 2, a level 3, and a level 4. So this could be created on a bulletin board space. This is actually a bulletin, it's on my bulletin board now, but really what it is, it's one of those trifold boards that I've just tacked up there temporarily. But this trifold board can be used and moved around your classroom. So we call it a bump it up board because I want students to understand how, if they're starting down here at level 1 where they have a very simple, basic, maybe one sentence simple answer, I want them to understand what an answer, a good answer, is going to look like at each of the 3 levels. So I start with having it blank because we're going to build this together. Now this is going to be a theme that you're going to notice from tonight, is that I always start, it may look pretty, but the bones of what's actually going to go up on the board is going to be co-created with my students, so it's something that we can do together. So we start at level 1 and we're going to look at that sample. So I might put the success criteria here. I might put a sample of student work at this level 1. Now, in all reality, I probably won't put an actual sample of student work. I will look at my students' responses, and then I will construct a replica of student work that is typical of a level 1 answer, and I will put that up there so that I don't actually have a student's piece of work sitting at a level 1 response. And then we will talk about, with my students, I will talk how I move from a level 1 to a level 2 response, and we may talk about adding more details, or I may have an example or a reason as to why I might have that opinion, and we will build that. Now, you may have seen those ice cream rubrics where you have a level 1 might just be 1 scoop of ice cream, a level 2 might be 2 scoops of ice cream, and a level 3 might be 2 scoops of ice cream with some chocolate sauce and sprinkles, and then you build, and there's more and more to that. I do sometimes like to move away from that ice cream analogy and stick here with the level, with the 3 or the 4 level progression going up, primarily because I find that sometimes students attribute a better answer with just being a longer answer. But then sometimes what you might get is a student rambling through different answers, and they will just add lots of unnecessary details that still don't actually make it a level 4 response, even though it's quite a long answer, because it simply is just more and more of the same kind of stuff. So I do try to move away from that and do focus on the success criteria that I co-create with my students, where we're moving from simple and basic to some information, to most of the information that they require, to a thorough understanding of what it is that they're responding to, or the question that they are responding to. And I will put samples and I'll put success criteria up for each one of these targets. And that will sit on the board. And then if I'm conferencing with students or marking with students, they have a reference as to what that looks like. Now, to also look at the Bump It Up board, I also want students to have a framework for how their paragraph needs to be structured. Because I'm teaching grade 4s and grade 5s, moving into responses, we're really looking at what those paragraphs look like. So I've used 2 different frameworks that will help my students. Again, they're both related to food, but I find that students are actually really interested when they are related to food. So the first example that I use is a hamburger paragraph. So I start here with my hamburger paragraph. And again, I start with my hamburger paragraph and it's blank. I don't have anything created with it, the frame already ready to go. What I want is for us to build that together and give an example of what that looks like. So we talk about how the top bun and the bottom bun are our introduction and our conclusion sentence. Now this is typically used, the hamburger is typically used to just simulate a regular paragraph. So we want an opening and a closing sentence, and we talk about what that looks like and sounds like. We repeat the words from the question, we don't give away too many details, and we put in our opinion in here. And that's the hamburger. Then we talk about what makes the response better. So I would create something like this, where I would have a hamburger and perhaps some toppings, replicating maybe cheese and tomatoes and ketchup. So I would put this and I would relate these 2 pieces of the answer. So I would talk about how this might be a detail from the text. So this would be an example that they would pull straight out of the text that would help them to answer that question. But it's not simply that we just want a detail from the text. So we don't want them just pulling out on page 4 it said this and on page 5 it said this. We also want them to take the next step and relate that detail that they've pulled from the text. And I refer often to this topping area as relating that connection or that example from the text, relating it back to the question. So we want to have a response, and also we want to explain how that text example relates back to that question or the opinion. So then we'll talk about what that might be. I might put sticky notes up in these sections for students as we're working on this together. And we talk about how perhaps a level 2 answer, so maybe a level 1 answer would only have the hamburger bun and it might not have any of the stuff in the middle. Maybe a level 2 might have 1 hamburger, or it might have maybe 2 hamburgers, but without some of the details. So we'll talk about what that looks like in the class, and I will just add those in. And then we want to have all 3 of those hamburgers. So we want 3 details from the text. And then I also will put a different one. So the reason I've got 2 red hamburgers with ketchup and cheese, and then I have a green, is because not only do I want text details, but I also like connections, where students are connecting what they're reading to their own ideas. So we want details from the text, but we also want a student's own ideas that will help them to support their answer. So I'll make this anchor chart and I'll often post it on the board near my Bump It Up wall so that these are all connected. My success criteria will relate to this. I might even have pictures of what a hamburger might look like if this is the model of a paragraph that I happen to be using. So we'll build these, we'll take them off, we'll put them on. And again, they're blank when I start because I don't want to have it completely built. Because this is simply just a poster. If I built all of this prior to my students working on this with me, then, and I'm going to take this in and maybe use this in my classroom. So if I am building this before my students have had a chance to do it with me, then it's just a poster that's hanging in my classroom, and it's not as meaningful if I have all of the pieces and we build it together and we cover this with sticky notes, or we write on these examples, and I do that with my students. So I will prep these pieces, but this will be an entire lesson where I will talk about how to build this hamburger and what that's going to look like, and we'll model what that looks like together. We will do it with each other. We'll do it with a partner where they'll come up with a sticky note and answer those questions. So we're using the gradual release of responsibility to model, share, guide students prior to them writing their individual, independent hamburger paragraphs. So that's one model that I have used. The other one that I'm using is an Oreo cookie model. So my Oreo cookie model is very similar to the hamburger paragraph. One of the reasons I really like using the Oreo response as opposed to the hamburger response is because in the word Oreo, you have a meaning for each one of these letters. So students will often easily remember these things. They also really like the reference point. If I'm saying to them, here's your Oreo, I want your response. I want you to give me, an Oreo cookie. So they know that they've got that top and the bottom where this is where they're putting the opinion. So the Oreo response stands for opinion, reason, explanation, and back to opinion. Now, I do try to encourage my students that I don't just simply want one single thin Oreo cookie, but I actually prefer double and triple stuffed Oreos. So when we do that, we talk about how we want lots of reasons that support our opinion and lots of examples from the text. So different from the hamburger paragraph, where the hamburger will often help us just to structure a paragraph, the Oreo response lends itself more if you're asking an opinion. So if you want the students to explain their own opinions in their responses to the text. So it will change depending on the type of question you're asking students to respond to. This one is great if the question you're asking is asking students to also explain their opinion as it relates to the book that they're reading. So same with the hamburger paragraph. I will pre-prepare these little cutouts for students where they are reason and explanation so that they can visually see. We'll reference that again on our Bump It Up board, that maybe we want a single stuffed Oreo or we want a double stuffed Oreo, and they'll know that the reasons and explanations. One of the things I think is really important when we're having students build better answers is that we don't just want all reasons or we don't just want all explanations, but we do want both of those related. We want the details from the text, but we also need our students to relate those details that they're pulling from the text or the examples from the text, and they need to relate them back to that question being asked or this opinion statement that they're making. So if you're asking them what they think about a character's choices, so for example, one of the questions you might ask is the character in the story a good person? So that's an opinion question that a student may need to answer. So their opinion is, yes, I think they're a good person. Now they're going to pull out details from the text that support that opinion, where they have to say they were a good person when they did this. They were a good person when they did this. But if they just pull those details out of the text, there's not enough proof that explains why that event in the story proves their point. So they need to be able to explain it. They can't just simply pull out examples from the text without explaining why that example helps to support their opinion. So both the Oreo response and the hamburger paragraph, along with the Bump It Up board, are three of the ways that I help my students to build better answers. Now, I use the gradual release of responsibility to walk my students through these structures. So we talk about what level answers look like, what it is we're looking for, that we want level 3 because they are on target answers. It also helps students to understand what a level 4 might look like. It gives them exemplars and success criteria at each level so that they know what they're being evaluated on. And then using the hamburger or the Oreo gives them the framework to help them understand how to structure their paragraph, especially if you're looking at early junior students, because they're often new to this type of response writing. So those are the three different ways that I help my students to write better answers. So I hope that gave you some ideas. You can find these Bump It Up headers in my free resource library that is available when you sign up for my email list. So if you have my 4 or 5 long-range plans, or you've signed up for the Inquiry 101 course, you will have access to these Bump It Up levels where you can print out all of these little headers on colored paper that matches your classroom, and you can build this in your classroom. And you will find both the Oreo response and hamburger organizers in my Ignited Literacy series. So maybe not these ones that I have created and drawn myself. These are easily created with construction paper and some chart paper, and maybe a hand from some kids. But I have organizers and a poster version of these in my October and November Ignited Literacy series. So they are there along with the corresponding lessons that use both of those response types. So I hope that this gave you some ideas of what kind of ways that you can help your students write better answers. So thanks so much for joining me tonight. If you want more information on these responses and where to get all of the resources from tonight, you can check out the blog post that will be posted later on tonight that corresponds with tonight's video at www.madlylearning.com. And if you want to see this or previous episodes of Teaching with Inquiry Live, you can catch those on podcast replay or the YouTube channel, and you can find the links to all of that at www.teachingwithinquirylive. Thanks so much for joining me, and we will see you next Monday at 9 p.m. Talk to you later. Bye for now.